Welcome, everyone. Welcome all to this virtual program of the Magnes Collection of Jewish Art and Life. I am so glad you're joining us for this conversation. For any of you who don't know already, the Magnes is a museum and research center at the University of California, Berkeley, and one of the world's preeminent Jewish museums. We aim to connect people of all backgrounds with the history, vibrancy, and diversity of Jewish life through our exhibitions and programs. This panel discussion has been planned for many months, and I am delighted to have this outstanding group of authors gathered for it. I will introduce Angy, Cohen, our moderator, and then we have decided not to spend our time reading bios to you, so I will post the other bios in the chat. Angy Cohen is a researcher on contemporary Sephardic culture at the Spanish National Research Council and the University of Calgary. Through a combination of ethnographic research and text analysis, she has studied Sephardi modernity with a focus on the Jewish communities of the Maghreb. She has also studied the Mizrahi experience in Israel, Sephardi Mizrahi feminism, and the religiosity and ethical world of Mizrahi women. And here's Angy.
Well, good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on which side of the planet you're watching this from. This author panel is part of the exhibit In Plain Sight, Jewish Arts and Lives in the Muslim World, of the Magnes Collection of Jewish Art and Life at University of California, Berkeley. Understanding of Jewish cultures is a mission of the Magnes Museum and Research Center. The idea of Jewish cultures, in plural, connects with the mission of our writers today, who represent different approaches to the diversity of Jewish life. The exhibit was curated through the effort of individuals who sat in front of others with different views to craft a shared narrative that could embrace difference. The objects of the exhibit and the stories behind them show that we can belong when we can embrace difference. Jewish lives in the Muslim world have been told in multiple languages and represented through multiple lenses. I'm going to share my screen to show only a few of the pieces of the exhibit. Second. Here. Yeah. Yeah. Can we all see? Yeah, right. This exhibit shows, for example, ketubot written in Arabic, donated by the Karaite community, a depiction of Moshe and Aaron standing in front of Pharaoh in the style of Persian art. We find Jewish texts, attires, and objects infused and shaped by surrounding Muslim cultures, which is actually nothing to be surprised about. These images, however, challenge the contemporary attempts to keep Jews and Muslims not only apart, but also opposed to each other, often violently so, as if this was the natural state of things. I think the strength of this connection between Jews and Muslims, though, does not lie in our similarities. I think the strength of these stories lies in the world we share despite our differences. This exhibit shows a world that was shared even if separation and conflict may have existed. If we need to have a lot in common in order to coexist and live together, our shared world is too fragile. This exhibit shows the blurred boundaries of a shared world and culture where difference can indeed exist. That way, Seder plate with depictions of a mosque or a khamsa for protection are not anomalies, but relics of a reality that is worth revisiting. In this sense, this exhibit goes beyond the fetishization or exaggerated fixation on objects of everyday life that sometimes end up becoming metonyms or substitutes of the cultures they belong to. The exhibit serves both preservation and continuity. preservation of things past, and continuity through the presence of three Jewish authors whose families come from different places in the Muslim world, and whose work, in one way or the other, responds to that background. One common theme across Sephardi and Mizrahi literature, that is, literature produced by Jews from Muslim countries in Israel, is the reference to in-betweenness, being in between worlds, in between cultures, in between languages that are supposed to be in conflict. This in-betweenness goes hand in hand with the experience of one's culture being marginal. That no matter how much research on Mizrahi literatures and cultures and production by Mizrahi authors there is, these experiences, literatures, and intellectual productions remain marginal in terms of their representation in mainstream Israeli and Jewish cultural spaces and institutions. However, the in-betweenness of Mizrahim and the experience of marginality have also been reclaimed as alternative roads to a different and better future through a different understanding of the Jewish self, so to say. In relation to this, I would like to quote a paragraph from the exhibit's introductory text that will lead to my first question for you all. The quote is, the echoes of the Jewish-Muslim encounters are in fact at the core of today's Jewish experience. They speak of human connections across divides, prompt reconsideration of assumptions that shape our public, cultural, and political debates, and map the precious possibilities and inherent fragility of coexistence, mutual appreciation, and belonging to many cultures at once. My question is, I would like to hear about the stories that you heard in your families about Jewish life in the Muslim world, and how those stories may relate to this idea of belonging to many different cultures, to many cultures at once, of different possibilities of coexistence, including the fragility of those possibilities. And relatedly, what family stories do you carry with you when you think about your own belonging to different worlds and your own vision of coexistence and appreciation of the multiple cultures you live in? Maybe we can start with Ayelet.
Why? No, I'm kidding. Well, it's such a huge question. I'm just trying to think where to start. Yeah, I grew up on stories like that. Like one of the main things that I've heard from my grandmother, basically had only hair. My grandfather had died by the time I was born, and the other side, the paternal side, was less communicative. But she said that she lived in the north of Yemen, where the Muslims and Jews did really mix. In other parts in Yemen, like in Sana'a, for example, they were very segregated. But in rural areas and in northern parts of Yemen, it was very mixed, and they lived amongst each other. And she said to me that they told them not to go. They told them not to leave, and that they warned them. They said, you know, they're going to kill you there. Don't go. Like, stay here. That said, she also, like, when I grew up and started talking about the idea of Arab Jewish identity, she totally scoffed at that. You know, she said, that's not a thing, right? Like for them, again, in Yemen, because like there's something false about also, like, obviously, we know that, like trying to put all Mizrahi, and you said cultures, right? It's so, the stories are different, the experiences are different. But in Yemen, where there were no other minorities, it was the Muslims and the Jews, you know, or how she saw it, the Arabs and the Jews. That's what it was. So for her, that idea was just, you know, ridiculous. You know, you could say we were Yemeni Jews, but we were not Arab Jews. They were either Arab or a Jew. The thought about the in-betweenness, it's interesting to me because there's a few layers to that. And I think Wolby would probably relate, because we were also immigrants ourselves. Will still lives in the US. I lived in Canada for so long. So I feel like there's the in-betweenness was obviously so much more, defined or refined when I moved abroad. But it also made me reflect on my grandmother and my grandparents' experiences, both in Yemen and in Israel, right? Because once they came to Israel, suddenly everything they were hoping for proved to be not as promising. The promised land was not as promising as they had hoped. Yeah, you gotta go. I'm really sorry. This is not going to work. Um, yeah, so it definitely, I started to see them. I think my interest in Yemeniness and my interest in Mizrachiness and my interest in my own Arabness didn't come until I moved away. Because once I was away, I was able to kind of see it in a different context, um, reflect on my grandparents' experiences. Um, Especially again my grandmother, because she's a woman and I could see myself in her somehow, like the language barriers and so on, the cultural gaps, but yeah, the in-betweenness became more clear to me in Canada, and then I could look back at my life in Israel and see that I in a sense always carried it, right? But I don't know that I knew that until I moved away. Um, yeah, I don't know where to continue going with this, so maybe we'll just move on to someone else, and if need be, I can pick it up again.
So great, yeah, great. So since you mentioned him, Ruby, do you want to leave it where Ayelet?
Yeah, with
leave it on?
pleasure. Thank you. And it's great to be here with all of you. I want to pick up on what Ayelet said. I can totally relate to the in-betweenness. I think that's such a good way of capturing it. And it's like a minority within a minority, a global. And so there's so much, it's so lush and rich. I also want to connect to the whole idea of that lumping all of us into a category is not something that works for me. I never identified as Mizrahi. We're Persian. The idea of an Arab Jew is very alien to me. I know what the grandfather of, and again, I respect, I know Almog, our friend Almog, has done amazing things with it. But like it for me, this is not like an identity that I am in any way connected to. And I think that Ayelet was right. It's a modern, and I'm gonna just say it, made up identity that's more of a political and ideological statement than a description of how it was. The grandparents of the people who revived Jewish Arab culture would never say, I'm an Arab Jew. The Arabs were the other, with whom they had a very complex relationship. Speaking of complexity, not to say complicated, I know that in certain circles, and I'm sure that the exhibition that we're now part of is one of them. There is an effort to create a very harmonious picture, and I appreciate, Angy, the fact that you said that it was complex relationship. So the stories I grew up with are a big puncture of this bubble of harmony and collaboration. My family came from the northeastern city of Mashhad in Iran. And there's many stories about the origins of our family, including of our community, with people which came from all over the world, including a certain a story that some of the families that are of the community are actually had to run away from Arabia because of the Mohammedan war and basically the great ethnocide that Muhammad did in Arabia against the Jews. It's like forcibly convert them or push them out of Arabia. Arabia was a very Jewish area for many centuries. And our family grew up lived in the city of Mashhad, which is a fanatical Shiite center. And a week before the Passover of 1839, there was a big pogrom in the city. And after that, in the eve of Pesach, which Pesach, by the way, is a holiday that our community holds in a very kind of makpid way, like really a very deep Pesach experience. The Jews of our ancestors were given a very cruel choice: convert or die, or convert or die, or leave the city without your assets, which means you'll die 2 months later of starvation in some place on the road to nowhere. After much debate, some say the women of the community pushed for the more pragmatic choice. We don't have records of these conversations. The community as a whole decided to accept Islam and live Jewishly in underground. And for 4 to 5 generations, we were Marranos. We were hidden Jews, keeping the commandments and the identity of Jewish Judaism in the cellars, in great danger. And the Shiites in Mashhad were very fanatical, and they were looking for reasons to harm the Jews. And some of our ancestors had to make Hajj trips to Mecca and became Haji and had Muslim names. And there are many stories about the practices of how to keep the identity in secret. So Ayelet, when you say about in-betweenness, I feel like my identity even made me even more. It's almost like we carry the like hidden in us. So I always have a few chambers of identity. This story was very present in our life. Every Pesach, my father would make a point of telling it, and I do the same now with my daughters. But even not on Pesach, we knew it, and I was imagining, and it was a very live story in our mind. Our ancestors were officially allowed to come out as Jews again in 1925 because of a secularist king who was trying to subdue the Islamists in Iran by giving religious freedom to the minorities oppressed by Islam. So speaking of scoff, I scoff every time somebody's trying to create this like pretty picture of the relationship. I know the relationship was at times very fertile and at times very oppressive, at times collaborative, and at times very, very racist and anti-Semitic. Jews in Iran, even those who were allowed to stay openly Jewish, for example, were not allowed to go out on rainy days to the street because we were considered tameh, we were considered defiling. So water in Shiite Islam carries defilement. So if rainwater poured on a Jew and then went down to the street, it will defile the Muslims. So the relationship, as I know it, is a very fraught relationship. Having said that, my father came back in 1948 as a young Zionist pioneer to Israel, immediately after the state was declared. And yet he never went back to Iran, but he kept missing it and talking about it. So there was clearly an element of longing and of love too. It wasn't just hate. But when you said the stories, this is the story. And it was a very large story, very formative story in my life and my identity. Thank you.
Before we go into Almog, I just want to add to what you were saying, Ruby, that I think the second and third generations task is probably to be able to sustain the contradiction in the and the ambivalence and the ambiguity of many of these stories, sometimes within one single family. And those of us who are researchers or writers or whatever, I think it is a very important moral commitment to not try to resolve this conflict, but to sustain it. And yeah, that's it. So Almog, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you, and as I'm continuing ambivalence in stories, I find it a good route to go from into the stories. And first, when you ask the question, there are the stories that we're told, but many of the stories were, in many senses, embodied. In the sense, first of all, in the sense of sounds and smells and the connection between the generation that goes beyond stories. So there are things that you know, or that you know from the faces of your grandparents and your parents, which were not only communicated through words. And in that sense, like the ground of the memory, like when I look at the roots of my memories of my grandparents from my mother's side, from Baghdad, was connected to hearing the language, the Baghdadi Judeo-Arabic. And in that sense, it was already a story in the language, in the sense of hearing them speaking to my mother in Arabic and her answering them in Hebrew. So understanding that it is a common language for them, but only one side is willing to continue speaking it, and the other one is passive in it, is listening to it. It was also the experience of this language as a familial, as an intimate language in a situation in which it wasn't the right choice to speak it on the street, like to hear your grandparents speak it on the street. Now, also bodily, in a sense, like, because some stories were not told, and maybe I'll say something about what the grandparents could say and what the parents could say, like, because there is a large generational gap there. Like there was a scar on my grandfather's face, and it was, an issue after he passed away. Was it a scar from the 1941 Farhud, the massacre in Baghdad, or was it the Shoshanat Yericho scar, like at the bite of the mosquito? Right? So there was something, that you could see, but in a sense, it wasn't talked about between the grandparents and some of their children. So we had two options later on. Now, a very critical moment to memory for us was at 1991, when like the American war on Iraq, and for the first time, like Iraq was on television and family was gathering together, and we saw Baghdad, and we saw the bridges falling, and it was a debate, like if someone remembers that bridge and walked over it, between older uncles and aunts and my grandmother. So that was a moment in which like the political present was in a way a source to for memory to go back. Again, it came back as a debate. Like those were things that were never agreed in a sense. Like one said that we are seeing now this neighborhood, and the other one said it was that neighborhood. In a sense, which was connected, coming back to what I said, that there was an issue. Like my mother came to Israel at the age of 5. So she doesn't have a lot of direct memories before that age. And for my grandfather, like he heard this idea that they're supposed to be the desert generation, the generation that will be forgotten, right? And he didn't forget himself, he didn't forget Arabic, but he thought that in a way it's his mission not to pass too much of the stories, right? So it was, in a sense, not everybody heard, like it was very connected to like older aunts heard more and remembered more and could pass later on. And the direct transmission between my grandfather, my mother, it was less present. My grandmother, who lived after him, could speak more about it, didn't accept, in a sense, this idea that it's better for the children not to hear more about it. And again, like memories came back, like in the stories then by my grandmother and my mother about my grandfather, which were connected to life in Baghdad, like to his job at the bank. And it was always in a way, you know, the memory from Baghdad and then the memory here. Like in Baghdad, he was in the bank, and here he was a keeper, like shomer of orchards next to Netanya. So like this falling between situations was like a memory, but it's not surprising that it came, like the two memories came together in a sense. So maybe I'll stop here and I'll continue.
And that's just like the patrimonial value of memories, right? Whether something is transmitted and passed on or not, it has to do with the question that the parents are asking themselves: is this memory going to become part of your patrimony, or is this memory going to be detrimental to you? And
Can I
can't
add
imagine like
something to
asking
this
yourself,
actually?
yeah, of course.
I'm thinking about something you sent me once, actually, Angie. You sent me a research paper. I think it was Sigal Ron who wrote it, and it was titled, I might be wrong, it was titled "My Life, There's Nothing to Tell."
It was Sigal.
And it was, no, yeah, that's right. And I'm thinking about like some of the stories that we were not told because we were not told. Like I always thought like, oh, my grandmother doesn't, she's not into storytelling. She has no use for it. She's too busy. She's raising children. But I don't think it was just that. I think it was beyond that. It was something about just kind of letting, like what you said, Almog, about not passing it on, like letting it be, moving on, starting new. So there was the stories that I heard really were after I asked and I probed and that's when I got the good stories. But that took me a long time. And by the time that I heard the real stories, I was in my 30s, and I was thinking also about what Ruby said about the story. And I think the story, although again, I had to probe for it, but once I probed for it, like it became much more, told again and again, was the story of the orphans decree in Yemen. Because my grandmother was married off at the age of 12 to avoid that, right? And the orphans decree, basically, children who were orphans were, taken and converted to Islam, right? In a sense, it was like their idea of protecting the children or whatnot, but in reality, it was forcing children to convert to Islam and taking them away from their extended family, their aunts and uncles and so on. And that's why my grandmother was married off, at a very young age, to kind of make sure that nothing happens. And even though, so there was like some sort of, on one hand, she had fond memories of those surrounding her, the neighbors, right? But she did not think fondly of the government or the Yemeni government or the authorities, right? So it was kind of a complicated relationship, which I think some immigrants would say the same about Israel too, right? On one hand, there was the authorities who may have done certain things, awful things to them when they arrived in Israel, but on the other hand, they came to the land that they, yearned for, and so on. So that kind of, just again, complicated layers of experiences. But yeah, I just wanted to. I feel like when I was caught by surprise and I didn't tell the story, that was our story that kind of haunted us after that. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Ayelet, Ayelet, so did she remain married to the same person?
Yes. Okay. So another story that I
If you're
discovered
gonna tell
later
us the
on.
story, give us the story. Yalla.
I have more stories. I have lots of stories because, like, once I started, that's what I'm saying. Once I started unveiling it, and I'm so glad I did. I did it like shortly after that she died, and I actually managed to record those stories and spend time with her. Like she was always not really. She didn't really want to talk. And there was the language barrier. But what happened is that they arrived in Israel. It was then mandated Palestine, and it was my grandmother, my grandfather, her daughter, their daughter, and the first wife. There was a first wife. I did not know about this until, much, much later. And my grandmother, and she also had a daughter, and my grandmother very smartly looked around, realized it was not something that was common. In Yemen it was. And because she was such a amazing, brave, and feminist woman, she recognized the opportunity and she said to my grandfather, it's me or her, because I make the pun that her tsara was באמת tsara, צרורה. It doesn't work in English. Yeah, she was not nice to her, and she took my aunt and took off to her cousin in Rehovot. And my grandfather took a few days to figure out what he wants, and he came after her and said, she's gone, come back. And they lived together, had 6 children, and lived together till the end of his days, happily. As much as happy, she wasn't a very happy person, but as happy as she could be, they were happy. And the other woman never forgave her or us. Like, she would never allow her daughter to see her half siblings, and she kind of carried on that indignance for life. But yeah, they remained married. But that's another thing that they took, from in Yemen, that was common amongst Jews as well, right? again, maybe more so in the rural areas, maybe more so in the north. The Sanani experience from the capital is very different. Yeah.
Angy, can I ask
Okay.
one more question? I'm sorry to be annoying.
You're
I
not annoying.
I have a theory, and I want to test it if you don't mind. Can we ask both Almog and Ayelet where you are in the sibling? Are you the oldest, the middle, or the youngest? I'm just curious, and then I'll tell you my theory.
There are 6 of us, and I'm 5th, so I'm one of the younger ones.
Here goes my theory. Almog,
I'm the youngest.
you're the youngest.
I am the youngest too.
You are?
Yeah.
So
And you?
my theory, I'm the oldest. My theory is the
Ah.
oldest and the youngest are usually the ones who are most interested, and they kind of channel in a weird way. They channel the old country and the elder, while the kids in the middle are often freer and are less, they just less have the burden, but also the rewards of being part of it's not an exact science, but I've seen it.
Yeah.
My sisters are going to love your theory
Bye,
because
Ayelet. You have
this
to
is
ruin my theory. I
I
mean, I'll
ruined it.
remember this.
Okay, I can say something about that may make me a part of this. I'm the
Okay.
5th, but I was the youngest for almost 8 years,
Okay, good.
right? And then he showed up,
Yeah.
my youngest brother. So I don't know. Yeah.
But there's something about division of memory. I want to continue something that Angy said before about how there's a burden, but the privilege of carrying the memory with all its complication
the patrimony,
and
yeah.
preserving, working with it. And I found that in families and in communities, there are certain people who shoulder this willingly, sometimes not so willingly, who are either burdened or happily take on the role of the preserver, and the others
Yeah.
in a way perhaps are set free to just blend, integrate, and be in the present. I always felt from a very young age that I had one foot in the deep past of my family and one foot in the present. And this
Yeah.
is a very strong experience. I was drawn to the elderly. I sat with the old people. I listened to their stories. They recognized it. They poured their stories into me. And I very willingly absorbed it. So there was almost like it was designated to me, a role of the preserver of memory. And I feel like all of us here, in a way, might be those kids, right?
It might be, in a sense, like we can think of it as obsession with memory, right? Which becomes fruitful in writing, maybe in other crafts, it's less fruitful. But in a sense, also like, I think that the point that the obsession starts is connected like to the critical points. And one critical point is the immigration itself. And maybe that's like your theory of the older sibling. And the next point is the point in which you are frightened that it's the end of the memory line, like that the grandparents are already passing away, and the question of who will carry the memory becomes very crucial, right? And that's like I think that when my grandparents passed away, like it was also always that moment, you know, of too late, like of understanding that something will not be able to be passed in the usual way, and some other way must be found. So it was always in a way like a too late understanding.
I think we could talk about this for a very long time, but there's another theme that we need to cover. So maybe we can come back to this later or in another context. Rootedness in diaspora is one of the themes of the exhibit. However, all three of you were not born nor raised in diaspora, in exile, at least not in theory. You were all born and raised in Israel, and yet another common thread of so-called Mizrahi literature, or whatever we want to call it, is that the experience of a diaspora, of rootedness, does not disappear in Israel, but if anything, it becomes stronger. That's a repeated theme among Mizrahi writers. So we know that the Jewish experience is one of relocations, moves, and multiple diasporas as much as it is an experience of multiple belongings. In fact, if we've learned something from the idea of the melting pot, is that the Jewish experience becomes agonizingly diasporic and not joyfully so when we try to homogenize it. This leads me to my second and last question. How do you feel your cultural legacies, different in each case, inform your work as writers? In other words, to what extent are your family's stories, languages, and cultural experiences present in your work? And how do they relate to your own aesthetic, moral, and political commitments? Maybe we can start with Almog, since you were the last to talk. I don't know if there's any logic to that, but
Any order will work. I can say that I feel that writing is work of imagination, but that always connects to materials from reality, from which you can imagine. But in a way, like the reality in the sense, the homogeneous reality in the sense of what is reality through media or school or government is, of course, very difficult for literature, right? It's not flexible. And what for me, the family legacy was there to present the cracks, like the places in which the big reality represented was not really whole, was not really complete, and had different faces or ambivalencies inside it. And from that, in the sense, like the opportunity to imagine other possibilities, like in a sense, this monopoly of the present reality is always that's the reality, that's the only reality possible. And it makes you think that the future should be molded only from that. And in that sense, like going back to the family past, and not only family, I should say, like in the sense, if you think about like, for me, I thought about the family, but I thought also like of the generations of Jewish Iraqi writers earlier in Israel and in Iraq. And when you look at the differences, like at the projects, the big projects that they had, with all their complexities, like in the sense that early writers in the 20th century were optimistic that a Jewish writer in Arabic, in literary Arabic, can channel and write also through the Muslim traditions, as in modern Arab culture, we are all inheritors of the Islamic tradition. A generation later, you see it in the sense that Jews write in a kind of like a neutral way. So their protagonists are not specifically Jewish, right? What will return in Israel with Iraqi Jewish writers like in the 50s of 60s saying to them, you're not supposed to, again, against ktiva datit, ethnic writing. Why are you writing about your ethnic group? Why not writing about universal nice people from the majority group? So when you have it, that the majority group in the 40s was the Iraqi Muslim, and the majority group in the 50s and 60s was the Israeli Ashkenazi, then you see the relativeness of that, which allows you, like, in a sense, to go beyond that. Or I will mention one last thing that Ruby mentioned, like the Jewish Arab identity, right? So for writers in the 30s and 40s, like Jewish Arab identity in Iraq was an optimistic project. It was saying we, the minorities, will be part of the future liberal democratic Iraq, and we're all Arabs now. We were all Arabs and we will be all Arabs. Now, when those writers in Israel in the 50s and 60s, when they spoke about their Jewish Arab identity, it was in challenging Zionism, saying Zionism is saying that Jewishness is both religion and nationality, but we have another identity, and they don't contradict. Being an Arab and being a Jew doesn't contradict. But that project also, in a sense, didn't succeed because, like a later writer, like in the 70s and 80s, Samir Naqash, who wrote in literary Arabic in Israel, but he understood that also in Iraq, as an Israeli citizen, he's not accepted. When he spoke of himself as a Jewish Arab, it was a criticism on Israeli nationalism and also on Arab nationalism. Like all of the national projects in the 20th century betrayed the Arab Jews. Okay, so in that sense, like those memories, if we take it as like writers, as a family, generation by generation, and the family, in a way, for me, were like this world of where to start the imagination from, where to start with not taking for granted the reality I grew up into in the 80s and 90s, and what other options, like can I sit in Jerusalem and write about Baghdad in 50 years from now in the future? Will it be part of Iraqi literature? Those transitions that are basic to literature and to the imagination, but that you can't do it without disbelieving the like the official reality.
Let's go then in the reverse order. Then Ruby, then Ayelet.
Thank you, Almog, for this very intriguing and good presentation of this idea. I will speak about myself and about my writing and my identity as a writer, and I surprisingly, almost shockingly, have never written. Only recently, I wrote one short story that I published in a newspaper last year that had any Iranian, Persian, Jewish flavor. And otherwise, my writing, and I'm thinking about what Almog just said about what a good citizens of the Hebrew Literary Republic I am, that I insist on writing right about the majority. It just you got me thinking there, Almog, of how I compartmentalized, maybe in the spirit of my holy ancestors who had to compartmentalize their identity. And, I compartmentalize my identity, and I'm very connected to my Persian roots, and I speak Persian, and I translate from the Persian, and I speak about it all the time, and I cook Persian. I'm very interested, and my daughters are very excited about this part of their heritage. And yet, in my writing, it does not exist. As if I have a double life. As if I drank that Kool-Aid that Almog described of a writer writes about universal characters. You wanna write about your family, that's self-indulgent. And that's interesting. Now, it could very well be, and that's like an unconscious thing that I'm unearthing now as we speak, that, growing up in Jerusalem, and I grew up in a very Ashkenazi, upper middle class, secular, very highly educated neighborhood. Our ethnic identity was not something to boast. I always talked about it and like celebrated it even as a kid, but it was, and I'm sure that I will hear interesting resonance from Ayelet and Almog about it, that the European culture was culture, while we had was folklore, perhaps. And this is something that took me years to undo. And I really managed to detach myself from this understanding when I arrived in New York right after my army service when I was 22 years old. And I met the community that my parents left in Tehran many, many decades before, who moved there. The entire community basically moved from Tehran to New York after the revolution in Iran in 1979. So in 1980, 81, everybody moved to New York. And when I arrived there, I learned how to speak real Persian, and I also discovered the amazing riches of Persian culture, the poetry, the literature, the art, things we did not know growing in Israel. We thought that ours was folklore, or we were told that. So that was a huge discovery for me, rearrange my identity. I had to go away to continue what Ayelet said. I had to go to New York in order to discover how rich my cultural roots are. And then I realized that my father, all through these years, was quoting Hafez and was quoting Saadi and was very fluent in Persian literature. And I loved it, but I never put one and one together. But the reality of it is that my writing pretends that I'm not a Persian Jew, which is fascinating. And it's a lot of food for thought for me after this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really, really like trying to like control myself because we have very limited time, and I'm trying to keep this because all of these could lead to a much, much longer and needed
Wow.
conversation. Ayelet, yeah.
Wow, I can't wait to read what, you might write if you write more about your Persian Jewish identity. I can't wait. Yeah, okay. So I know where our time is short. But yeah, I'm thinking of a few things. I'm thinking first back to the idea of what I said, having to leave. Like I've always written, okay? I've always written. For me, it's a little bit more complicated, like since the age of 5, and even and I've published from a very young age. I was like in Aleph Shilano and Ma'ariv Noir. I've written my whole life. And I can't say that I was particularly interested in my Yemeni identity, but in my writing as a younger person, but also I wasn't interested in my Yemeni identity as a younger person because I was, again, being kind of programmed to believe all these things will be said, about what's culture, and a kid who loves to read and a kid who loves to write. And, like I knew what was considered cultural, and that is what I wanted. And I go back to the idea of also, again, a kid who reads, of representation. I spent my entire childhood and teen years reading everything in sight and never, never seen a kid like me or someone like my grandmother represented in Hebrew literature, and obviously not in world literature either, but in Israeli literature, I have never seen that. So that says so many things. And also, like not seeing a Yemeni author anywhere. So what does it say to me about my dreams of becoming an author, and what stories can I tell, and what stories matter, and what stories are interesting, and what are, what is culture and what is folklore, right? So this is kind of how I came into my switch into English language. And I say switch like it's an easy thing that just happened. Obviously, it was after years of not writing at all and moving to Canada. I can't go over this whole thing. But when the two things that happened simultaneously in Canada was suddenly, like Obi has said, I wanted more of my Yemeniness. And every time I came back, I immersed myself in it in every possible way, with spending time with my family, but also with my community. One of the greatest things for me about coming back to Israel is coming back not just to my family, but also to a community of Israelis, Yemeni Jews. But also my writing begged to tell stories of Yemeni people. And it's, again, I'm pretending it was an easy thing. It was not. I found myself battling against this. I can't tell you how many times I wrote a beautiful woman as fair-skinned and light-haired before I caught myself. And it's like, this woman's she's going to be Yemeni. Her last name is going to be, Shalabi. She's going to have curly hair. It was a constant work. But yeah, I felt like other little Yemeni girls deserve what I was denied. I wanted, it was a work of rectifying some of it. I'm like, what if I write a great Yemeni Jewish novel, where main character's name is Saida and Salha, like my grandmothers? What if, what can I do that? Can I, little me do something like that? And that became kind of a mission for me. And the final thing I want to say about culture and folklore and literature and representation is that in my and storytelling, that in my work of connecting with that facet of identity, I discovered the women's songs of Yemeni women, and that just blew my mind, because not only I did not know a Yemeni author, I also was under the impression, I looked at other, people with Europeans, like ancestors, literary ancestors, right? That they can refer to. And even Iraqi, I was like, they have all these guys, but still, like, they have all these like amazing, giants they can be on their shoulders. And all I had was Shabazi. And I mean, it wasn't really my thing, Of course, I admire a lot of what he does, but that's not what I do. And I was like, I don't have that. I don't have that literary heritage. If anything, I have this, a heritage of women who were not allowed to study, were not allowed to pray, were illiterate in both languages. And then I find out that there's this rich, amazing tradition of women penning or writing songs about love and about betrayal and about the first wife being horrible. There's songs like that, and I found just I felt so buoyed by that, and that's when I decided to incorporate that into my novel, some of these songs and some of those traditions. Yeah, again, I can speak for much longer about this, but maybe I'll stop here.
Do
Yeah.
you guys want to answer to each other? Is there anything that got you thinking about what any of you have said that you would like to respond to?
I have one quick comment question to Ayelet. I hear in your words that I know that this might not have been the conscious reason why you chose to write in English, which is something we had conversations about in the past.
Yeah.
Because you're such a Hebrew writer, but you write in English, which is amazing, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and now when you said, it seemed to me that it could be almost like you needed a different language in order,
Mm-hmm.
like a masquerade, Neshet Masechot, where you need to
Mm-hmm.
put that other mask of another language in order
Mm-hmm.
to dare and be you. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
having listened to you now, maybe you
Mm-hmm.
needed to move your writing to the English so that you
Yeah. It wasn't just the geographical move, right? It was
yes,
also the lingual. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I
to
think
liberate
it's yeah.
yourself and dare
Mm-hmm.
go to that
Mm-hmm.
place.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah, I
fascinating.
think yeah. I think you're onto something for sure. Mm-hmm.
Hmm. And anyone else wants to respond? Almog, I think you signaled that you wanted to respond to something.
I signaled in telepathy, but uh, I think that like maybe to add to things that Ayelet and Ruby said about where in life it changed, because it's clear to all of us that it's not that that when we were born or when we were children, we thought that that's like the center of culture, or that that's the most cool thing to do, or however we will approach it. I think that for me, the memory that triggered going back to Arabic literature and Iraqi literature and the Iraqi story was connected to the fact that when I was 17 and my grandmother from Baghdad was dementing, she forgot Hebrew and she came back to speak only in Arabic. And that was an influential experience because like the cousins of the from the older sisters of my mother could speak Iraqi Arabic and could speak with her, and we couldn't. Like we knew words, we learned a little at school, but we couldn't speak. And prior to that, you know, a child takes everything as natural. Like, okay, so the grandparents has a different accent, they have a different language. It doesn't say that I need to have it. Maybe my grandchildren will speak Albanian and, I won't understand them. But at that stage, at the age of 17, I understood that a big force, a big historical force from the outside, the state, nationalism, society, decided that we wouldn't be able to say goodbye, that we wouldn't be able to talk at that stage of life. And so it did become, for me, in a sense, at that moment, a mission. It took me a long while. Like, I decided to go back and study Arabic. It took me years. I was lazy at 17, but 6 years later, I came back to it. But in that sense, like, I think that it was always there, like the contradictions and the tension between the family culture and the outside world, and how it's connected to the conflict, and how it's connected to economical gaps in Israel, and to what is culture and what is not culture, as was said. So it was always there, and it always became clear for a moment, and then later on was again disguised. And that was for me the moment that all masks fell, and I understood for myself what I want to do. It was, of course, very far away still, but it's connected to maybe to what I said earlier, or was connected to Ruby's theory about young children, or the possibility of this fear of complete loss of culture, right? And standing in front of it, like standing in front of the abyss, and you feel that you must do something for yourself and for others or outside.
I find that also that that return to the untold stories is, at least in my experience, not only allowed me to fill in the gaps, but it also had a healing effect for family relationships. Like, it also works the other way. Like, it allowed me to understand my dad in a different way. It allowed me to understand the world he came from. It allowed me to do for him what he wasn't able to do for us. Like, by putting that transmission there, and by researching that and collecting the stories that nobody told us, and all that, I did something that maybe because I am the youngest, I love this theory, Ruby. This is I'm going to be sharing this theory with my sisters in 15 minutes. But but I did what my sisters had always complained about not having. But it's not that they were super interested either. But there was this gap, and then when you do that and when you explore it, and it also has a healing effect in your relationship with people, with actual people, people that exist in your family.
I love that, Angy. I love that. That is like, yeah, so well put.
Yeah.
Dan?
We have a couple of questions and not very much time, but do you see them, Angy? Do you want me to read them out, or should?
Can you read them out?
Yeah, let's start with this one. someone asks, if I correctly understood, there is different insight in the terms of identity depending on where you are in the world. Can you share any ideas on the Mizrahi Jewish identity, thinking about those who migrated to Latin America?
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if any of us is an expert on that. I know I've seen some of the communities, and I think that they thrive and they have an organic connection to the community and the roots. Um, the only honestly in North America, there are only two communities that are not Ashkenazi. One is the Syrian Jewish, basically Aleppo, Halabim in New York. And then there's the Persian Jewish community, which is also newer. Some of them live in LA, and our community, the Mashadi Jews, live in a suburb of New York called Great Neck. But and have a very kind of I think healthy and organic relationship to their roots that is not marred by conflict and is not marred by a feeling that they have to justify it as a legitimate alternative Jewish history to the Ashkenazi majority.
In
I
South America is basically the same.
Yes.
I've worked on Moroccan Jews in Argentina. They in no way see themselves as Mizrahi. I don't think anyone would even know the word, or maybe some people who speak Hebrew, but I'm not sure they would know much more than that. I'm talking about the generation that arrived from Morocco to Argentina, and they have a very intense relationship with Morocco. They're in fact in the Moroccan synagogue there is a clock with the time in Morocco in Tetuan, and yeah, which it's a beautiful idea also. And yeah, there's a much less conflictive relationship. Yeah. And they do transmit. Like the idea of transmission is critically important for them.
Yeah. The whole Mizrahi identity, in my opinion, is very site-specific to Israel.
Very. Mm,
It's very Israeli, and it's basically an inner conversation in Israeli society
yeah.
about hegemony, about legitimacy, about who is the hegemonist majority and whose identity becomes transparent, and both Ayelet and Almog said very important things about this struggle and about this
And there's a social class element.
yes, and there's, as Almog pointed out, there's a social, there's an economic, there's a prestige, it's not just an innocent
No.
regular culture war. It's like always, it's also a socioeconomic war of the classes. This is not something I see abroad so much. Like from my Persian Jewish relatives, they're all successful financially.
Yeah.
They are very secure in their Jewish identity. They have no issues with the Ashkenazi Jews. It's because it seems like there's been no need to fight over hegemony. And that's a very different reality than the one we know in Israel.
Mm, mm.
Well, and that's our time. Yeah, I want to just extend a thank you to all four of you. It was a beautiful, rich conversation. I think it left us all with a lot to think about. And we did record this, and it will be posted on the Magnes website once we have it properly captioned. And so it'll be available for people to continue to learn from. Thanks
Thank you
again,
very
everyone.
much.
Thanks a lot and good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much. Good
Thank you
night.
very much.